and welcome to chapter 5, excuse me, learning, excuse me, learning objective 4. And what we're going to look at today are those things which determine supply elasticity. So let's go ahead and I'll share my screen with you. Okay, so what determines the elasticity of supply? And when we look at elasticity of supply, remember what we're doing is looking at how quickly can a supplier respond to an increase in the market price. If they can respond very quickly, then they are elastic. If they can't respond as quickly, then they're inelastic. So here are some of the determinants to kind of show if a supplier is elastic or not. So again, the more easily they can increase their quantity, then they can capture that change in price, that increase in price. Okay. All right. So one of the things that comes back is the idea that elasticity of supply is greater in the long run than in the short run, because then we can do things like build new factories and so on. So the first determinant of price elasticity of supply, so elasticity of supply, the first one is spare production capacity. So if we have a bunch of square footage in our business that we can utilize to increase production, that would make us more elastic. So elasticity of supply, if we have spare production capacity, would be greater than 1 or elastic. Stocks of finished products and components. So if we have a lot of inventory, that means our elasticity of supply is greater than 1 or elastic. Now, we talk about the factors and go back to chapter 1. Remember the factors of production of land, labor, and capital. I'll give you a very easy one. So if you wanted to attach two pieces of paper together, what are some of the different ways you could do that? Obviously, you could use a staple. Okay, fine. You could fold over the corner. That's another way. You might be able to rubber band it. That's another way. Paper clip it. That's another way. So what each of those means is there's lots of different factors you could use to attach pieces of paper together. Those are operationally mobile, meaning that it's easy to switch from one to the other. So we would say if there are substitute factors of production that you could be using, then your elasticity of supply will be greater than 1 or more elastic. So think of all of the different substitutes for sugar, perhaps. Now, granted, sugar is probably the thing you want, but you could also use Splenda. You could use any of the different sweeteners that are out there, corn syrup, and so on. Again, time period, everything is more elastic in the long run. So that's the same as the elasticity of demand. We compute elasticity of supply using that ARC method. The only difference between elasticity of supply is instead of looking at the quantity demanded as we did in elasticity of demand, now we're going to look at the quantity supplied. So that's really the only difference. It's the exact same formula that you saw previously. Now, different types of supply curves. So we can have, if the price elasticity is equal to 1, then it's unit elastic. So just kind of use the same reference that we used before. So as the price increases, the quantity supplied increases, positive correlation there, by exactly the same amount. If supply is elastic, as the price increases, the quantity supplied is going to increase a lot. If supply is inelastic, as the price increases, the quantity supplied is going to increase, but just by a very little bit. You can see if we talk about supply and costs, that if you're inelastic, you cannot capture as much profit if the price goes up. So I'm going to put unable to profit from the increase in the price, right? Whereas if you are elastic, you're able to capture those profits and, you know, maybe grow your business or what have you. Okay. Now, just as there were a variety of demand curves, there's a variety of supply curves. Keep in mind that the flatter something is, either curve, in this case, supply, that the flatter the supply curve, the more elastic that it will be, the more it can react quickly to changes in the market. So here's some examples. The first one over here in panel A, elasticity equals 0. So remember, we look at what is the percent change in price. We divide that into the percent change in the quantity. And in this case, it's going to equal 0. Why? Because the quantity supplied does not change. Here, this is relatively steep in panel B. And because it's relatively steep, here's a 22% increase in price, and we have a 10% increase in the quantity supplied. So 10% divided by 22% is going to give us something less than 1, hence inelastic. Here is unit elastic. Again, you can tell because it's 22% and 22%. So remember, elasticity of supply is the percent change in the quantity supplied. In this case, 22%, percent change in the quantity, percent change in price, 22%, so it equals 1. And notice that this supply curve here in panel C is a bit flatter than we saw in panel B. The next ones are where we have greater than 1 or elastic. So here we have a 67% increase in the quantity supplied, right? Divided by a 22% increase in price. And we're going to get approximately 3. Because that 3 is greater than 1, then therefore this is an elastic supply curve. We can also have a perfectly elastic supply curve, okay? Now, what happens here, and this will be equal to infinity, and we're going to see this in some particular industries that we study in upcoming chapters, where the supply curve here, at any price above that quantity, supply will be infinite. So again, supply would equal elasticity of supply would equal infinity if it's perfectly horizontal. Okay, just as the demand curve had different elasticities, a supply curve has different elasticities across it. Remember, they're not the same thing as slope. So in a supply curve, what we would say is, if we look at this, we would say elasticity of supply tends to be inelastic. Then it tends to be unit elastic. And then down here, it tends to be elastic. Now think about why that might be so. And it kind of makes sense if you think about supply as a representative of cost. These individuals, remember, made up of a lot of different suppliers. The individuals that are supplying the product down here have pretty low cost, so that gives them increased flexibility. Whereas the suppliers up here have a much higher cost, so they don't have as much flexibility. We're using elasticity of supply as a synonym for flexibility in the marketplace. Okay, so this is just a nicer little way of looking at it. In the real world, we have curve shapes, which does change things a little bit where the math is concerned. But here you get the idea that elasticity of supply is large, starts off down at the bottom because of those low costs. And then as we get higher and the costs start to increase for those suppliers, we tend to see that a little bit. We tend to see that. Didn't mean to do that. There we go. Let's see if I can go back. There we are. Okay, there we are. Okay, so I'd like to try this out. Now, the supply of beachfront property. What would beachfront property be? Would it be easy to produce more of? And I'm talking about real beachfront property, not that stuff you see in Ohio. Okay, it's not, right? It's limited. It's very scarce in the resource. So we would say that the elasticity of supply of beachfront property is going to be inelastic or less than 1. The supply of new cars. If the price doubles in new cars, could you produce more if you're, say, GM? The answer is yeah, you could. So that tends to be, in looking at these two products, tends to be more elastic or greater than 1. Now, suppose population growth causes demand for both goods to double. All right, so what does that mean? If demand doubles or shifts outward, the price is going to increase. Okay. At each price, quantity doubles. Okay. For which will the price change the most? And for which will the quantity change the most? So now we want to think about this and go beachfront property versus new cars and use this idea of elasticities in terms of the pitch of the supply curve. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of draw this over here and I think it'll make sense to you. So I'm going to do beachfront property. I'm just going to stay here in green. So here's our quantity and here's our price. And this will be beachfront. And I'm going to go ahead and put a supply curve in here. Okay. And I'm going to, let's see, how do I want to do this? Yeah. I'm going to go ahead and put in a demand curve just for reference. Okay. So the demand for both goods doubles. So I'm going to go ahead and shift this outward to D2. Okay, so here's our price. It's our original price at P1. Here's Q1. And now we have P2. And we have Q2. Okay, now let's take a look at, and I'll do the supply of new cars in red. So I'm going to go ahead and put new cars up here. And I'm going to put the quantity here and price. I'm going to go ahead and start with the demand curve. But this time, when I draw the supply curve, I want to keep in mind that the supply is going to be flatter. So I drew this one almost unit elastic, but I'm going to draw this one really flat. So there we are. And here's the price, P1, and here's the quantity, Q1. So that's where we're starting with. Now, the demand curve is going to shift outward and to the right. So we're going to go ahead and shift it. I'm going to try to keep it about the same amount. Let's see if I can do this. To D2. And let's find our new equilibriums. So P2 will be here. And Q2 will be way out there. So let's take a look. For which product will the price change the most? So up here in beachfront property, we have this amount of change here in price. In new cars, we have this amount of change in price. So for which one does it change the most? Beachfront. Because you can't make more of it. It's very limited. For which one does the quantity change the most? So I'm going to go ahead and look at this and I'm going to say, okay, well, here was our quantity in beachfront and here's our quantity in cars. So going back to those, going back to that and kind of comparing the two, we know the quantity will change the most for cars. Okay, This just makes it a little bit more, you know, because this is very steep. And because it's very steep, we know the elasticity of supply is less than 1 or it's inelastic. So now we can be very precise and we can cause that demand curve to double. And you can see very easily that the price here, the increase in price, is quite large. The quantity does not appear as large as the increase in price. Here is new cars. Again, notice that that's flatter, meaning that the elasticity of supply is elastic or greater than 1, showing that flexibility that we can produce more cars. And now we shift the demand curve. Notice that the price does not go up a lot, but the amount of quantity goes up considerably. And that's just what happens in terms of elasticities in these particular examples. Again, because of that flatter, steeper feature that we've talked about, not only in demand, but in supply as well. Okay, so that's the end of this learning objective, and I will see you back next time. Thanks.